Almost didn't make it back in time. I was closing all my windows, messing around today with all the places we are live today. So this is cool. So first time we are experimenting here with live on Facebook. We are live on Twitch. You can go on Twitter, but it'll switch you to their Twitch app. And we are going to be live on YouTube, and then we are also going to be live on LinkedIn. That's the only one I didn't get a chance to check. I didn't even know they had a live thing, but it's all part of this deal I can do. And so giving it a shot. And as you can see, scrolling across the bottom, if you're watching, hey, let us know where you're at, where you're watching from. Leave a comment. I was checking those out right before Leroy and I were waiting, and it looks like all those are getting passed through. Leroy, I just noticed you might want to lower your camera there a little bit, buddy. Getting your chin covered up by the lower third, so maybe you could lower your camera down just a little bit. But so we're excited. Leroy and I are here today. Jane can't be here with us. Hey, that's perfect. Jane can't be here today. Won't say anything in details, just except she's going through a bunch of stuff. Needs to make some. She's busy this weekend. Let's put it that way. And so those that know her, just be praying. It's nothing terrible, tragic, just sort of something crazy keeping her busy, And so that's going to keep her moving for a while. So that's where we're at today. And so how are you doing, Leroy? How's your day been? Mine has been filled with creating these little lower thirds and scrolling bars and making sure we can go live on multiple platforms.
I have been hanging with my brothers. My brothers actually came out west to Las Vegas.
I saw some pics of that, yeah.
I know. And Margie and I thought it was a good time to come out there and meet them. So we surprised them out here in Vegas, which is, Vegas is a lot different than Vegas was, say, 20 years ago. Probably about 25 years ago. It's a lot different. You cannot walk down the street in Vegas and avoid a contact high from all the marijuana that is smoked on the streets. Fortunately, we're all wearing masks. And you need a mask to just walk. I don't care if it's 102 degrees outside. It's just like a marijuana haze.
Oh, wow.
It's insane.
Well, just wear a mask made out of cheesecloth. They didn't say what the materials have to be. You could just,
Oh, my gosh. You need it.
Or not cheesecloth. What is something real, I don't know, something that you can breathe really well. Probably cheesecloth, not the thing, But
something thick. It's insane. Yeah. Anyway, we're in Vegas, and, we're just trying to stay in our room. Actually, we walked through the casino to see if we could find a restaurant today, and there's nothing open.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very interesting place right now. It's like a ghost town.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah, I wondered about that. It's got to be weird going through Vegas and some of those places right now. They're just everybody shut down, everybody not knowing what they're doing, and that's just crazy.
Yeah,
go ahead.
There are no shows or anything. Anyway, who wants to talk about Vegas, right? It's we have better things to talk about. Vegas is interesting, though. It's very, very different.
Yeah, it's its own world out there, that's for sure, man. And Lord knows when we're going to get back to some degree of normal, but hopefully it won't be forever.
Yeah.
Hopefully it won't be forever.
We do hope that we get to some normalcy. This COVID thing makes you realize how important human touch is, how important relationships are.
Yeah.
Just being able to be around people and to see, that kind of stunted everyone everywhere wearing masks all the time.
Yeah.
Is it's a somewhat depressing sight to see. But what can you say?
Hey, we got Ferris watching us today. What's up, brother? Good to hear from you, man. Glad you can be on. That's cool. We're glad to see you, my friend. And I guess he's on Facebook, it looks like, as well. So we got Yeah, I'm excited, man. I guess I'm a little geeked out right now, just sort of like focused on this all day. And we actually have a show to do, believe it or not, and we're going to talk about some. We were going to be talking about this week a little bit of something related to apologetics and some of those other issues, just in general. Like last week was our show on apologetics and the spiritual life. Jane was with us for that one. I thought it was a great show, actually. But when she kind of dropped out, we kind of had, well, maybe we do a different thing. But I kind of want Jane in on some of those apologetics ones. I think this one we're going to talk about,
Right.
what about the people who are lost or never hear the gospel. And so I don't think she wants to miss that talk because she was kind of excited about it. So we changed sort of last minute. You've been working on an article that you are looking to think maybe publish a little bit. And this is, more of a current event type thing that Leroy's been working on, and sort of the running title he had that I had for the show was the Idolatry of Whiteness, and so that is not a controversial thing at all.
No, it isn't.
I'm
It
actually
is,
not
yeah.
sure. I'm actually not sure where some of this may go or not. I don't know, but. What I wanted to do was just kind of say, hey, why don't you open up, maybe explain the basic premise, or do you think we need to define what you mean by whiteness first
Yeah,
before you get into
that's
that? Maybe that's a better place to start.
yeah. So I drive 40 minutes to work every day, and and sometimes it's about an hour depending on traffic. So I try to find things to occupy my mind on the drive, and I started listening to these three guys, one conservative and two ultra liberal atheists, talk about race. And one of the guys started making a quote, and his quote went something like this. He said, if you look 20 years ago, the gap between the black imprisonment rate and the white imprisonment rate was about 10%. If you look at it today, it's 18%. And then he began to argue. He began to make this case, which is, if you focused on the 18%, which people claim is disparity and needs to change, and we need to do something about, he made the case that if you never bothered to look at the numbers, you would never see the progress, because most people will look at the 18% mark, that it's grown by 8% in 20 years, and talk about a disparity. But when you delve deeper into the numbers, you see that the black incarceration rate on every age in the stratosphere, in the age range, is halved. 18 to 19, the black imprisonment rate is at 72% less. From 20 to 25, it's at 63% less. From 26 to 33, it's at 53% less. And from 34 to 49, it's at 52% less. So across the board, the black prison rate has halved. And as he started to think about that, I started to think of how often we use the words disparity, how often we measure our success in terms of whites. Now, I thought that.
So you're talking about just to make sure I'm understanding. So you're talking about the conversation of, for those who are black, measuring their success purely against, like, okay, here's this statistic for black people, here's this statistic for white people. That's our measure of success. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
The
That's
penchant
exactly right.
to do that, the propensity in media or whatever to always kind of give these stats one next to you. That's what you're talking about. You were thinking about.
That's exactly right. And the reason why I think it's a problem is because it masks success. If you look at black achievement over the last 20 years, whether you're talking about in business ownership, home ownership, graduation rates, higher advanced degrees, on every level, blacks have far exceeded blacks in the past. So I argue that instead of measuring blacks against whites on every single measurement, what we need to measure is blacks now versus blacks then. But the more and more I looked at it, I thought to myself, every comparison, no matter which news show you look at, no matter which social economic program that talks about these issues, the measurement is always blacks versus whites. And I think that's perverse. I think that it masks Black achievement. It isn't to say that Blacks shouldn't consider where we stand amongst every single race, but the very fact that it's always pitted against whites tells me that something more is going on than measuring Black achievement, and that something more is the impetus for this article.
Yeah. So that does bring up the question, because I know the title of your article was, I think, the corrupt idolatry. Perverse.
The perverse idolization of whiteness.
So the perverse idolization of whiteness, which that word whiteness obviously carries a lot of, comes with a lot of baggage potentially, and a lot of connotations. And so, and actually, this is actually the part that I think is maybe the most controversial part about your whole deal. But I was thinking about it. I read your article and I was like, man, I don't know if we could do this. But I actually think you're arguing in line with some of the most common people who would maybe fall in the category of critical race theory, CRT type people, in terms of what you're actually arguing. I don't think it's much different than some. Now, again, it depends on how it's defined, who's defining it. There's a lot of complexity there that we're not going to get into. Sure. But so what were you? How would you? I have a definition that I want to read in a minute here. What that came to my mind. But I was curious from you, when you say whiteness, what do you mean by that?
Well, I wanted to say, in particular, white people in America. Period.
Okay, so do you mean white people?
I'm not meaning whiteness all across the board in every racial, category, like non-Hispanic whites, which if we look at statistics, they do break those statistics down between not merely American whites, but they break it down to non-Hispanic whites, which means whites from North Africa and Europe and those sorts of things. So I think that there's a reason why they want to always measure or pit Black success against white success. I think there's a reason for that.
Okay, so let me pause there for 1 second. Let me ask you this then. Let me read to you a couple little short quotes that define that term whiteness. I'm going to put it up so folks can read it. So it's visible there now for everybody. And this is actually from Robin DiAngelo. I think that's a book you're familiar with. She wrote this book, White Fragility. Now, this is written from a critical race theory perspective. And we're not going to get into that today. We've actually done some shows on that and talked about that with some folks. I did an interview with Monique Dusan, Center for Biblical Unity. We talked about this and some of the problems, with critical race theory in general. But this term whiteness, I found, listen to this definition and think of that in light of what you're just saying and tell me if you think this fits with what you're thinking. She says this: whiteness rests upon a foundational premise, the definition of whites, as I guess white people, as the norm or standard for human and people of color as deviation from that norm. So, and then she goes on, white supremacy she defines as powerful ideology which promotes the idea of whiteness as the ideal for humanity. So what she means then there is that that in that definition of whiteness, just within this little focus here, that it's, I think it's actually compatible with what you're arguing there. That
it's 100% compatible with what I'm saying. That
we're saying, if here's this statistic that we say represents, broadly white people, and there's these statistics that represent Black people, why is white, the stat that covers the white people, used as the standard by which we measure all other people? And so I just wanted to run that by you. What are your thoughts on that definition? I
wasn't going to get that book, but I think I might have to get that book for that definition alone, because my interest in bringing it up is not to put down white people. It is not to.
Thank you. So when you put down white, you just mean me most of the time is what you put down.
Yeah, most of the time. Yeah.
But it's not because I'm white. It's just because you're mean to me.
Yeah, exactly right. My goal is not to put down white people, and it's not actually even to put down Black people. What it's to say is, if you were to ask the average Black person in America, and even the ones who are most angry, the most social justicey, though they would say that they don't want to adopt white culture, right? That's what they would say. They would say that they don't want to think in terms of the way that white people think. Yet every way in which they measure themselves is by white culture. And what I'm saying is, if you were to look at the economic statistics that are going on in our country as to who is doing the absolute best, it's not white people. White people, I mean, Indian people from the country India who live in America make twice as much money as white people do in their households. East Indians make about three-quarters as much money as white people. If you look at graduation from college rates, Asians far outstrip everyone in graduation rates. If you look at home ownership, non-Hispanic whites outstrip everyone in home ownership. And my question is, if the goal is to win the diversity game, in other words, to be the best, right, race, if that's what some people's goals are, or if the goal is to be as successful as you can, why are we not measuring ourselves by the most successful people in all of those categories and then doing what they do or doing better than they do? Why is it that no matter what pundit, no matter what book, no matter what economic individual, economist or sociologist, the measurement is always how blacks are doing in terms of whites, and it's idiotic. It's idiotic, totally. Unless you assume that there's something else going on that makes that measurement the only measurement worth understanding, which I think I know what it is, but I don't think it's been articulated very well. And I think whatever that is, we need to unhitch our ox from that cart and do what the best they're doing. I mean, I gave in my article, and I don't want to, if you have other questions, please by all means jump in.
No, go ahead.
I gave the illustration of.
By the way, my wife thinks your comments are interesting, which that's good.
I try to be.
I just want to make sure that you knew that she thought you were interesting.
Yeah, well,
you're the most interesting man in America.
Yeah, but I gave this illustration, and I think this illustration is totally apropos. Let's say that there is a kid somewhere in America who wants to be the best basketball player who ever lived. Well, he would never measure himself against LeBron James.
Amen to
he would
that.
measure himself against Michael Jordan, who was the greatest basketball player who ever lived. Now, let's say that his dream, his desire was to be the best. And let's say that the gap between Michael Jordan and LeBron is wider than it is. Now listen, LeBron is one of the all-time greats. If you're better than LeBron, you're going to be in the category of the all-time greats. But remember what the goal is. The goal is to be the best of all time. But let's just say that the gap between Michael and LeBron is vast. Yet that kid who claims that he wants to be the greatest basketball player of all time keeps measuring himself against the guy in second place. Well, you would say,
wait, what about, we have a question on my wife wants to say, what about Kobe?
Man, I use LeBron James because I'm not a big LeBron James fan. And any chance I get to put my finger on LeBron, LeBron is a heck of a basketball player, a heck of an entrepreneur.
He's the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA.
Yeah. I just don't like the comparison between him and Michael. I mean, Michael was the greatest we've ever seen. I mean, let's just be honest, right? But my point is, if the goal is to measure yourself against the greatest, and you keep measuring yourself against someone that's not even in the same category, you would think that there's something perverse going on, or you would say their goals are misaligned. Now, if you listen to black people, if black people were saying, hey, we want to measure ourselves against the white people in order to catch the Indians or the East Asians or the Asians, then you would say, okay, but that's not what the goal is. It's never the goal. It's always to catch the people, white people. And part of it has to do with our long history with white people. And it has to do with slavery. And it has to do with a lot of things. But if we're really trying to be the very best that we can be, measuring ourselves against white people is not the apropos measurement, is my point.
Yeah. So maybe part of the challenge is, and this is where it gets into the idea of what's considered, systemic racism or systemic injustices and all those other things. And again, there's a lot of complexity there. We're not unpacking all that in this show. We can, if people have questions, let us know, but we're just kind of using some of these terminologies and we'll define them a little bit for how we're going to use it here, but we recognize that it's way more complex than we're going to be able to dig into. But I guess what made me think about that's interesting is that let's just take for granted that there is systemic injustice, however maybe somebody wants to define that. I mean, maybe even it's independent of the terminology. and that is defined by using whiteness as the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it counterproductive then, even if that's the goal, with what you're saying, is that, okay, I believe there's systemic injustice and whiteness is the problem. We're comparing it that. So doesn't that propagate the system of injustice by saying,
Absolutely.
here's this stat for black success, here's this stat for white success. Let's compare those two and let that be the measure of success or
Exactly.
failure. Isn't that in and of itself propagating the same system that folks are saying they want to eliminate? I mean, that's honest question. It made me think about this when I read your article, and I hadn't really thought of it in this way before.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, doesn't that become a self-refuting argument for
Oh,
those who are really trying to say, let's get rid of the injustice, but yet the way of doing it, they're still comparing these two things that they say are the root cause of injustice.
exactly. I mean, you know, it's mind blowing when you start to look at it. I mean, you can't unsee it anymore. You would think that even those people who argue for systematic racism and systematic injustice, even their minds are affected by this very problem by always keeping the comparison between blacks and whites, and which is why those of us who don't make that argument make the claim that those people who are making that argument are doing it because of their hatred of whiteness. That's exactly why they do it.
Mm-hmm.
They think they want to tear white people down. And again, I mean, we have to have these discussions not because they're fun, but because what we're trying to do is to frame the world as it really is. And then we already know what we have an idea what we think it ought to be. But if we keep using these I don't want to say unfair, but abnormal comparisons, we're never going to see the world for what it really is, or see what's going on, or always be blinded by race issues instead of making the more positive argument that here's who's doing the best. What is it that they do? Let's understand, what it is culturally. Let's understand what it is educationally. Let's understand what it is financially, and see if we can emulate what the best are doing, so we can be the best at what we do. We do that in every stratosphere, every
Yeah.
sphere of life. We do that. We do that same thing. We try to understand what the best are doing. We try to learn from the best so that we can become, be in that category. But we keep preventing ourselves from being in that category by using these abnormal standards.
Hey, by the way, I don't want to lose track of that thought because I want to build on that a little bit. But Clark was asking here where to get the article, and I'll just let you answer. I know the answer to that, but
It isn't edited yet. I mean, I've sent it out to a couple of my friends to be edited, and it
yeah,
hasn't been posted anywhere. And I think we'll probably post it someplace after this.
yeah,
Depends on what we end up talking about.
yeah.
So,
Well,
but
that's right, 'cause Clark. I wanted to say too that part of the process to publishing this thing is we wanted to talk about it here a little bit live, and because Leroy he sent me the article, I looked at it, gave a few little thoughts. But I thought, man, sometimes when we talk about these things, man, light bulbs click, and it helps a lot. We get great questions from you folks watching and listening. So, yeah, it's not up yet. I don't know. I mean, we might put it on morethancake.org, or I don't know if you have other plans for
mhm.
anywhere else. I wasn't sure what you had going on. But if we post it, wherever we post it, we'll put it in the liner notes. And if it's on morethancake.org, obviously it'll be there. And then we'll post that. If it's somewhere else, we'll make sure the folks get links to that. So that'll
Yeah,
answer that question. But
what's very interesting about all these conversations is I think that people are forwarding these conversations because they keep the division going. They keep people dividing. I mean,
hmm,
if you could look at statistics and you could compare blacks then as to blacks now, I think that you would see that even when people went to the streets last month, there were no demands except
hmm,
defund the police. I mean, there was looting and all those other things, but there were no demands because things aren't the same. There has not been, contrary to popular belief, there has not been stagnation. I think that there are other reasons why, you know, people are in difficult situations. I don't think it's due to
hmm,
structural racism. I don't think it's due to systematic injustice. I do think that, given if we were to look at things as they really are, we would see that black are making different decisions and they're finding success in the decisions that they make.
hmm,
And I think on the main, while we wish for more success, and there's nothing that says that we have to stop where we are. But on the main, I think that blacks are doing better than we ever have. I mean, I think that's the case when we look at the statistics, and always comparing ourselves against people. And even if you consider whites are falling behind in categories that they've never been behind in. I mean, and you have to ask why. Why is that? But that's another story.
Well, hey, and Clark has another comment that I think is good that we want to maybe get into, touch on a little bit. It's that, kind of resonating with your point, why were we making these comparisons one to another to begin with? Doesn't that doesn't that build up that system in and of itself of injustice? And I think that's one issue, but there is a second issue that I think as Christians we have to recognize, regardless of how folks are using these terms of whiteness or, systemic injustice. Not to say that, again, that's a good discussion. I'm not saying it's insignificant, but there's a deeper issue that we have as a response to that is that what's the real comparison here is to, who we are in Christ, who we are made in the image of God, and what our future needs to be. And I want to get to Clark's point there, but I don't want to lose the point that just because we want to land there where we are doesn't mean it's wrong to discuss cultural issues where there is disparity that's due to racism or discrimination that have forced people to not have opportunity. Again, not guaranteeing equal outcomes is how we would view it, but just saying, look, if there are imbalances, there's nothing wrong with addressing those, and at the same time recognizing we point to a higher standard of who we are made in the image of God. So I think Clark's point has two good things.
I think the confusion is in equity versus equality. Our founding document says that all men are created equal. It says essentially all people are equal. But when you look at the financial situations, the educational situations, and every other socioeconomic situation, we don't find equality in that. But here's the argument. The argument is because we don't find equality, that there must be and that there's disparity, that disparity is engineered, when the answer may be something a little more simpler: decision making. As I've thought through this, I think that decisions are made differently in three different situations. The first situation is families. People make different decisions concerning how families are constructed. If you look at families where the husband and wife stay together over a long period of time, their children do better. 90%, some crazy statistic, 90% of the men who are in jail grew up in fatherless homes. Some ridiculous statistics out there. People make different decisions in their families. They make different decisions in their finances.
Let's stop on that one just for a second, because I think there's another example where I think we're always choosing either or as opposed to both and this is we've talked about this before, and I think this is a good point to pause on just that one idea, because so if we can say, look, you look at the number of youth in trouble, and we look at the percentages of born without fathers, as we've seen an increase of white families that are broken families. We've seen an increase in these negative statistics of imprisonment and trouble, lower education. We've seen that impact regardless of somebody's, skin color or racial makeup, whatever categories we want to put on that. So that's one factor we have to look at. At the same time, this is a both and thing. So that's a truth that comes from the scripture. We know that men and women are made to be moms and dads, and that's the most ideal environment to raise that family in for the most stability for our kids. But there's an addition to that. We also know that the welfare system, the New Deal, we had a whole show called this. The New Deal was a racist deal. And we saw how, this deal was used and promoted by Democrats and supported in the South, especially by segregationists who said, hey, look, we can't, keep blacks on the plantation, but we can use the idea of generosity and, hey, we're going to provide for you to make sure, hey, once you're on the government dole, we can control where you live. So we put you in these certain locations to keep you separated from intermarrying and interbreeding with white people, so that they use that system of welfare to control where black people could live. And they used it to make sure that, there was, hey, you're only getting these benefits if there's no man in the house. There's all these kind of things. I know several guys like Walter E. Williams or what's his name? The Sage from
Thomas Sowell.
South Central. No, Larry Elder has talked about, like, he remembers as a kid, that whenever the welfare man would come around for a check, all the men would go hide because they needed to prove that there was no man in the house. And so there's a both and here, that there is systemically reasons why I think the black community has such a higher rate of fatherless homes. So there is a systemic reason for that, and that it's caused that sort of disparity. But at the same time, there's still moral choices available. At least that's the way I'm seeing it. Well, I don't know. What do you think? What do you say about that?
No, I think some of that is true in part. I think most of the statistics about talking about welfare and there no dad being in the house is true. I trace it back a little bit differently. In the 1950s, and I started reading a couple books on this because I wanted to look at social policy and find out how we got to where we are today. And the main animating idea in the early 1950s was that people knew that they needed to take care of the people who didn't have, and this was mostly oriented toward whites in rural areas, how they wanted to help those people in the early 1950s. But the animating idea was that you did not, because the country was awash with money. I mean, we were approaching our first $1 trillion budget. I'm sorry, this is a little bit later, but we are awash with money after World War II. And people thought that because there were a record amount of jobs available, that if you didn't want a job, the only reason you were poor is because you didn't have a job. So all the programs were oriented toward people who didn't have fathers at home. Now, in the late 50s, 57 to the early 60s, particularly 63, is when all of these programs began to explode. I think if you were to look at the first program that we put out for American social policy was for $313 million, which was to attack poverty in poor black and white areas, which is about $2.5 billion in today's money. So we were, in the early 60s, we were willing to spend money on that. But that ethic that said, we're not really going to help men who can find gainful employment, because interestingly enough, early 60s, blacks and whites construed their destiny similarly in this way. Both blacks and whites believed that if you wanted to work, there was a job to be had. And the only reason that you didn't work is because you were lazy. That was how blacks and whites both construed themselves. Doesn't mean that there wasn't, as you talked about, the systematic racism that needed to be torn down by the 64 Civil Rights Bill. I'm just saying that idea that said that you didn't want to take care of men who weren't working is the most benign way you can put that statement out there. But it had an effect in poor families. It had a huge effect in poor families, because then there's no need for husbands and wives to strive to stay together, when times got difficult. The wife could just say, hey, get on out of here. That I think in my own family, and my brothers and I were just talking about this afternoon, that when my own mom and dad began to have problems, we were the typical middle class family growing up. But when they began to have problems, it became easier for them to separate permanently, because there was someone else there who would pick up the slack, so to speak. But what we missed out on was having a dad at home full time and a mom at home full time. And a lot of other deleterious things happen as a result of that in our family. I'm just saying that if we were to take the best look at that situation, it was hubris. It was thinking that you could really solve people's problems without understanding how they themselves made decisions in the short term, which carried with it long-term consequences that nobody understood at the time. So I think that's if we're just trying to not look at this as racism in intended policy, as opposed to an ethic that said we're just not going to take care of lazy men, and that having an adverse effect on families, both white and black.
Yeah. Yeah, you know,
But
go ahead.
no, I would say, but the point being that it forced men out of the home is exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and I know that Ferris mentioned he said he remembered that, and we get comments just to let everyone know we get comments a little bit on delay, and so I asked him kind of clarify. So when he was saying that, I think he was referring to he remembered the days of the welfare visits or something like that. I
Yeah,
think that's what he was saying. He
those are
remembers that,
real. Those are
but
real.
again, I could be misconstruing what you were remembering, brother. If I am, sorry, but I think there are a lot of folks that do remember those days and.
Those are
Um,
real.
and it wasn't, it wasn't isolated in how we
No.
approached it. But I think there's an interesting also part to this, because we want to bring in, as we brought in that idea of this biblical standard for how we measure this, not just success, like you were saying, it shouldn't be just one group against the other because those are really
Right.
artificial anyway. We all know that race is an artificial construct. I mean, that's the common, psychology of that.
Sure.
And that's what it's taught today in sociology books. That these are culturally predicated categories. So we're inventing these categories of race that fit with our cultural lens. So the thing is, we got to break outside. But for the world, they can't break outside because there is nothing outside culture. Culture in a materialist, naturalist worldview, there
Hmm.
is only the culture you're in. For the Christian, we can break outside of the culture and get an eternal perspective on our human
Right.
sacredness, on our dignity, on who we are. And so that gives us something to look at beyond that construct that's invented by the culture. And so, but that also applies to this idea of work too, which I think is interesting. Because what comes to mind is because I was just doing I was a paper that was worked as part of my one of my last PhD classes. Thank goodness, last paper, last class. But talking to talking about instructions, the household codes, and specifically though I was really looking at not one of the household codes, but in 1 Timothy. In chapter 5, the instructions to the widows, it talks about for the widows who are young enough and that their families can take care of them. They shouldn't be on the rolls. They shouldn't be taken care of by the church. Or if they're young enough to basically get remarried, or they should be taking care of their households. As opposed to tending for the household of God, they should be tending for the household for wherever their families are. And so there's this system where it's like, hey, if you are strong enough and able to work, you need to work. You need to
Right.
you don't just rely on the church for free handouts just because you can get them. Now, the church should not limit, what the caregiving we do in terms of for those in need, but we should also make sure that we're careful in that. And I think in principle, that could apply to society as well as, the church, everyone wants to talk about, justice for the world and stuff, but, what that looks like even in the New Testament is not what we often get the picture of in the culture of just handing
Right.
out free money to everybody. It's saying,
Right.
look, if you are young and strong and capable, then you need to work, and we need to not put barriers in the way.
Right.
So like if you're black, oh, you can't get this job, only whites apply or something like that. Obviously, if those things exist, we should speak against those things. And
Right.
we should be, as believers, the first to say that is not righteousness. That is not good. That is dehumanizing. That to treat people as less than human because of the color of their skin. But at the same
Hmm.
time, we shouldn't just say, oh, well, things have been rough, just let's give everybody money. Because if they're
Right.
young enough, strong enough, and capable enough, let's find things. Or if they don't exist, let's create opportunities for people to work and make sure that they have that dignity of work itself, because work is a valuable thing that amplifies the dignity that we are given as people created in the image of God. That's kind of what I was
Hmm.
thinking. Your thoughts on that, man?
No, I think you're 100% right. I mean, there's something that amazing. There's something creative that happens in an individual who works. Now, there's backbreaking work, but I remember my dad, who was a construction worker, and I remember when he came home from work. I love my dad. I respected him. My dad worked as hard as anybody that I've ever seen. He did construction for almost 34 years.
Hmm.
That to me was honorable service. he went out to work to provide for his family,
Hmm.
and he took care of us to the best that he could. He gave us a very good life for as long as he and my mother, were together. Um, and I think for the family, young men need examples.
Hmm.
And I remember when I was a boy, and I remember this is 1970s. My mother, this had to be about 78, 79, because my mother and dad were separated at this time. And I remember we used to go on the 1st and 15th to pick up our check. And I am not lying to you when I say to you this, that I saw so many men in those long lines. I thought that this is what you did when you got older. I thought that this is what men do when you got older, because there were
Mm.
so many men in those lines to get a check from the government. I think,
Mm.
I think that stunts people's growth. I think
Yeah.
that it robs them of dignity. I know that the government does it not to keep poor people down. I think that the government does it because it believes that there's structural poverty. In other words, it believes that there's a certain segment of people that is that are
But
white,
yeah.
black, whatever,
Well,
that are not going
yeah,
to do
but
well in a
that's
capitalistic
that's
society.
part of that. But that's part of that. What I think D'Angelo should recognize as "quote unquote" whiteness, because that goes back to Darwin's view that from his the social Darwinism, at least from the early 20th century, that believed that these traits of poverty were genetic, essentially. I mean, they didn't have genetics
Right,
at that point, but they were biological. They were part of evolution.
right,
So you didn't want that was about what a lot of the eugenics programs were about. The purity of the human race wasn't just
hmm,
white and black. There was there were Europeans, especially from the southern part of Europe, that were considered lower on the evolutionary scale.
sure,
But generally speaking, poverty was considered a result of biological inferiority. So you didn't want
right,
people marrying who are from wealthy classes of people to lower classes of people, because they believed that you'd be propagating a lower, biological quality, a lower quality humanness to the
right.
next generation. And so this is where I think this part of our welfare system is systemically unjust, in that that mentality today, that is the progressive liberal mentality,
It's
politically speaking,
destructive.
that some people can never overcome. That's a part of that racist history that saw some black people as incapable of doing it. We can't educate them out of this. They're just incapable. And they don't even know why they think that. But that comes from 100 years of believing this naturalist,
Yes,
materialist worldview. And so
yes.
that's what I'm talking about, that I think
No,
is
there's a
unjust.
video. There's a video that has been out since the 70s, and it is Thomas Sowell arguing with, um, I think her last name is O'Bannon, but she was in charge of Health and Human Services in Pennsylvania in the early 80s. And they're arguing, and I guarantee you, I'm going to find that link because it's out there, and you should watch it. Because she makes the very argument that you just made, that there are a number of people who are destined to fail, and what is going to happen to them, and whatever. And Thomas Sowell lays into her by simply arguing, they will fail because you subsidize their failure. You subsidize it. You subsidize their bad behavior. You subsidize their failure. That's why they don't succeed. And the conservative argument against this says that people are equal. That there's no destined amount of people there's no group of people who are destined to fail. There are people who fail because of decisions that they make. That people can be successful. That's a
And I would
conservative
add to
argument
this,
there.
I would add to the typical conservative view, though, that I think this is the part where the movement today has something right. Yes, it's because of bad choices and that, but there are injustices that are built into these systems that, no matter what your choices are difficult, sometimes not always impossible, but very difficult to overcome, unless you're some exceptional, like, athlete, or if you're exceptionally
See,
brilliant or something like that.
I
No,
know that.
but so no, I think there's a both and there, is all I'm saying, is that I
Yeah,
think that we have to be careful of that. And one of those, again, but I would point out as one of those injustices, that I think the way we do the welfare system, that keeps people, it makes it easier to stay poor than it makes it
yeah.
capable of coming out of poverty.
That part is easy. I mean, if you were to go back and you were to look at the welfare rolls under Kennedy, Johnson grew the welfare rolls under Kennedy by 2.5 times within 4 years. Um, if you look at the way these programs all function, there's a dedicated bureaucracy that grows up around managing these programs.
Yeah.
That dedicated bureaucracy is not about solving these problems,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
the moment that they solve them, their bureaucracy disappears. That dedicated bureaucracy is about staying in business, and it has been in business. And the welfare rolls have extended and are far greater than anyone who
Yeah.
started these programs could ever have imagined, because there's no
Yeah.
end state. There's no end date attached to these programs. They're not designed to help people grow. And I mean, and there's a whole other program about what's been done
Yeah.
politically in perspectives that undercut, manufacturing jobs in about a 6-year period, that wiped out, manufacturing, those low skilled jobs that allowed, people to pull themselves out of poverty and into the middle class. It's been a huge technological shifting that I'm just saying people don't understand. They haven't really gotten their minds around the
Mhm.
idea of how much the world has changed technologically, so that the very jobs that were here, that people could support families on and take
Yeah.
vacations and buy a car, those sorts of things, those jobs have been undercut
Yeah.
and have been shipped out of country because of decisions. So my point is, the things that have worked against poor black people and poor white people, have, I mean, we don't hear these discussions talked
Yeah.
about in our time.
Let me bring in a couple things here, because Wayne mentions here, he says that the welfare basically is built around this idea that it keeps the system going. It disincentivizes movement. It disincentivizes real solutions to those issues. And I think his comment's a good framework to go back to where Ferris was bringing out earlier, and he gave his own little story. He says this. He says one day my uncle was over, and the welfare lady came, and my mom asked my uncle to hide because the welfare worker would have assumed that my uncle was her boyfriend, and that or something like that, and that she would have been taken off the welfare roll. So here, so it brings together a couple things. One, you're talking about, what do young men and women see of their adults? The behaviors they observe, they assume are normal behaviors. And so
Right.
some of that is the choices and the things we do. Some of it is built into the system, which creates this sense that the system starts to work against that. And so here's where I think conservative and maybe liberal progressive are saying something similar, but for different reasons, and that's why they'll never
Oh yeah.
agree. But I think Christians, we could bridge this. So the conservatives, like you said, use the key word. They'll say that there's bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is keeping people down. Now, bureaucracy by nature is, for the most part, colorblind. It's not saying it doesn't care if you're the white man in poverty or the black man.
Nope.
To keep the system going, 70% of the money that comes in from taxes goes to feed the bureaucracy, not to feed the people that are hungry. I mean,
Right.
80, whatever, depends on, 70, 80, 60. It probably depends on what program we're talking about. But I'm just saying the vast majority of the money doesn't go to actually help people. It goes to help the bureaucracy. So
Right.
those people that have their job in the bureaucracy, they're invested in making sure it's sustained. Now, that's the conservative view. The liberal progressive type view is that this is racism. This is systemic racism or institutional injustice. And it's against, the white against the black. Now, I think there's historically, there's some truth to that and how things came about. But they also have to understand that because race is a social construct, that when they're saying racism was built into the system, it wasn't just against blacks. It was also against any poor whites or any people that were considered lower on this evolutionary scale. And so, yes, it harms, non-white people, and that's a bad thing. But the structure that's there that needs to be changed is not necessarily, doesn't even care at some point about black and white. So it's not just racism, but there is injustice, but it's injustice against all people that are trapped in that system. And maybe that disproportionately hurts some, others than not. We could have that distinction. It doesn't matter. The point is, we can both agree that there's things that have to change in those institutions, and if we care about those people there, and what do we believe about their capacities, if we remove those hurdles, is the real issue.
What's interesting about this? I think that if you go back and you read the thinking in the day, the context, I think that the people who originally, really began these programs when Kennedy came in the office, I don't think that Kennedy was thinking of trying to entrap black people in a failing system. The sheer amount of money that they spent since the late 1950s, in my opinion, militates against the idea of racism being embedded into the system. Because if racism is really embedded into the system, why not just give a cash payout to people and say, here are your reparations, go be on your own? That's not what they did. They kept expanding the roles of the system. I think that you have two poles within the system that want these roles expanded for two different reasons. I think conservative whites felt guilty about what happened because these programs really get in earnest about 2 weeks after the Civil Rights Bill. I think conservative whites felt guilty and wanted to make amends, which is why these programs expanded, and they dropped many of the former barriers to people getting into those programs. I think liberal whites and liberal blacks who got involved in the system saw it as a way to make money, because you need a grievance culture to keep the system and the spigots open and keep people in that position of guilt. I think we see that at work now. I think all of it, in my opinion, was hubris and arrogance, because they didn't understand how poor people framed their lives. Poor people frame their lives like, what's going on in my life today? You're going to give me money for a job today. Give me that money right now. Let me do what I want with that money. I'll worry about your job later. That's how poor people frame their lives. I mean, and I know that because it's how we grew up. We frame our lives on what's going on today. Now, the problem with that is there are long-term ramifications that we often don't think about.
Let me illustrate that real quick, because I think maybe see if this is an example of what you're talking about. So there's people that have gone into from these extreme poverty or systems that have gone into the NBA or to football or whatever, and within so many years of being out of the league, they're broke or they're completely bankrupt. And because they haven't learned how to, say, manage money. So I know that there's a lot of folks, and this is where I'll give somebody like LeBron James props. I know he's one example of this. I know a lot of those guys who have been smart with their investment try to meet with rookies coming in and say, don't make a decision for today. Don't buy the cars and the houses and all the other stuff and give your money away, all these parties. Invest for the future. But nobody ever told some people that, and they never saw it modeled to them. I think that's a modern day example that
totally
builds on your point.
Let me say this. I was listening to an economist who was answering this very question, and he said, and this is a black guy, his name is Glenn Lowry. He made the argument, why is it that people who are in different economic stratospheres or categories, why is it that they both make the same decisions on the kind of cars that they drive? And he says, why is it that people will go out and pay $105 for a pair of sneakers? And on and on and on when he's talking about money. And what he talks about is how poor people make the same economic decisions that richer white people do or richer people do. And he likened the lack of wealth accrual to decision making like that. And I thought he made a really compelling case. And that kind of dovetails with the decision making. People, the whole welfare system wants to rob people of, and I don't we're switched to this topic, but they want to rob people
well, it ties in.
Of the weight of the decisions that they make, of the weight. Think about it. If you knew that if you divorced your husband or separated from your husband, but there's a pot of money out there for you to get, it may not be as much money as you made with your husband, but it may separate you from your husband, and it disincentivizes you from reconciling with your husband. I'm just saying that's how people make decisions. That's how decisions was made in my house. People make decisions that way, and if you make policies that make it easy for people to make those decisions, you're certainly not encouraging dads to stay involved in their homes. And it's not as if dads, once they leave the homes, are going to stop having sex with other women and making other kids. I mean, it's a pernicious system, and it's not due to racism. I mean, I know that some people wanted to really force it into racism. I don't think that it is. I think that people in this country, people are making decisions, and they're not thinking long term about those decisions. It would be so. If it was racism, I would certainly be willing to agree. But I can think of young men that I grew up with, the least assuming young men. One kid is a doctor, other kids are lawyers, none of these kids are playing. We had one kid who grew up in our neighborhood too that I can think of that played professional sports. One played for the Dallas Cowboys. That was horrible. And the other one got drafted by the Clippers, number one in the NBA draft. But by and large, there are a lot of guys in our neighborhood who never made it in the pro basketball or football, who lived it very difficult lives, who were very successful people, not because of the struggle, but in spite of the struggle that they grew up in. And I just think that it's an easy out. It's an easy out to claim that there's some system over and above my head that makes it easy for me to fail. It's an easy out. And I would much rather us be robbed of that decision or that excuse, and then really consider my family. What decisions am I making my family? What decisions am I making financially? I mean, decisions in that particular category. And am I willing to live with the weight of these decisions and be able to take care of those things? I think that, and it doesn't matter whether I think you're black or white or whatever. I think these programs have arisen in order to rob people of the weight of their decisions, and in part because of guilt. I mean, if there's any racism, I would say it's the soft bigotry of low expectations. It is the soft bigotry of low expectations. Us looking at people and saying that there's a predestined amount of people who are going to fail, and then subsidizing that failure, and it becomes a fait accompli.
Well, and that's where I think, and this is, we'll summarize here in just a second because we're getting towards our end, believe it or not. I think when people say the system, there's racism built into the system, part of that, again, uses a current understanding of what we mean by race. But again, if you look at the eugenics folks back in the early 20th century, when they said race, when they talk about the purity of the race, it wasn't just a white and black issue. Yes, there was an extreme side of that but even then, there were whites that were lower. There was they would acknowledge, okay, there's one race, there's a human race,
society.
But there are lower whites on the scale of that. There are lower, certain European, like the southern parts of Europe, like I said earlier, were lower on the racial scale of human quality. Poor people were put on a lower scale, and so when we say the system is racist, part of that's we're reading anachronistic. We're reading back into the, what was then into what is now when we see it purely as a black-white thing. Again, not to ignore the black-white thing, but there is a lot more complexity there that I think actually makes your point of what. That's why I wanted to bring up that point again, is because when I could say yes, I do think that there are racial issues built into the system, but I would go back to look at how the culture defined it 100 years ago when those systems started to be built, not how we're defining it now. Right. That's what I'm saying.
Now that's a good point. That is a key point because 100 years ago, it would be designed for a specific group of people, and then decades later, you're going to expand that system to include not just a specific group, but other groups of people into that system. And both ideals are working on, both concept or construals are working on different contexts. And that's going to have a different effect.
Yeah. And now that we've changed so much of our definitions, this, I think, tends to more to what you hear from the conservative side, that the bureaucracy is, the people running it don't even know what the history of it is. They don't care what the history is. They just know that, hey, this is the system that supports me, that feeds my, I'm propagating politicians. I stay in power by promising to keep this system going. People that have come to depend on it. So the people doing it today aren't doing it because they're racist in that sense. They don't even realize that some of those systems were racist in the past, but they do it because that keeps them in power. And so there is a real legitimate reason for Christians to be concerned about these things and to want to see changes in that and modifications. But ultimately, ours has to be, and this is where I'll close and then I'll let you give your own thoughts here at the close. Ultimately, that change has to recognize that, one, that it begins with human individuals. The big difference between a lot of critical race theory ideas is that, individual humanity is diminished in comparison to the group identity. Identity comes from groups. Identity comes from the system. There is almost to the loss of individual identity. Christians say, look, there's corruption in the system, but it begins with individuals. So we do have to say that, look, the corruption begins with brokenness and sin in individuals, which then corrupts the systems. The way to heal it, not to ignore that this, not that we can't change the systems, but we also simultaneously have to change the hearts, redemption from sin. And the reason we care about that is because every individual we're talking about is made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And every individual has a value and has a worth that makes it worth changing these systems, that makes it worth talking about the hope we have in Jesus Christ. And there is a real reconciliation on the other side that is for believers. As much as there's division in the world and hatred, I always ask these people that are out there doing whatever, what's the end game?
Right.
Because they don't have an end game. But for the believer, be careful who we align ourselves with, because we have an end game. And that ultimate end game is reconciliation and hope. That I can look at you, Leroy, as my brother, and you can look at me as your brother. Yeah. Not because of our differences, not because of the skin color, but because we're one, both created in the image of God, and we have a Savior in Jesus Christ. And that's given us a new identity and a new community that's superior to these earthly kingdoms and these earthly communities.
Amen.
That's our end goal.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
So,
and this is a verse that really animated this whole talk for me. Paul is speaking to the rhetoricians in Corinth, and he writes this: we dare not classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. Then I'm going to skip all the way down to verse 17. That's 2 Corinthians 10, verse 12. And I'm going to skip all the way down to verse 17 to give you Paul's end statement. He says, But let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, for it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Our goal is not to compare ourselves with other people. It isn't. It's to compare ourselves to God's own approval. And when we do that, we do have an end state. We do have a point of reference that isn't wishy-washy, that isn't based on people pitting us against other people. It's based on God's own commendation and God's own approval. Why compare ourselves with white people when we can compare ourselves with what God has for us? I would also end with this. You seldom see believers who talk about these things in public, talk about what the ideal kingdom, if we want to use the word kingdom-minded individual, I'm not really, but what the ideal citizen of God's kingdom looks like. And that's Ephesians 1-5. We're reminded we're first told of what our inheritance is, and then we're reminded about who we used to be, and then we're told we're to be imitators of God as his dearly loved children. And then he tells us how we conduct ourselves in relationships with each other. And if that's really the ideal man or woman of God and what he looks like in the very end, then that's what we should point to, not these phony constructs by which people are using to entrap us in ideas that are hostile to the gospel. That's where my point of the perverse idolization of whiteness ends at. Because I think if we compare ourselves with anything other than what God himself approves, we're going to fall short of what God intends us to be.
Amen to that. Hey, well, we're out of time, believe it or not. This is good. I think we brought it back to the end of where your article is. I think there was a good discussion of some practical sides of what the implications of that are as we dealt with that welfare stuff. I don't think it was a real distraction from it. I think it just maybe put some feet. Yeah, I think it put some feet to it. I'll say that my passion right now, with all my studies that are going on, is really looking at this idea of human sacredness. And that's what we're talking about. I'm preaching on this tomorrow. I got a chance to preach at a church that I'm going to talk about this message through Romans 8. And I'm going to talk about this idea of human sacredness, B'Tselem Elohim, out of Genesis 1:27, and the power of that. And I'm even going to promote, I made these little shirts. You can see the little scroller at the bottom down here, morethancake.org/shop. And I want to have conversations about, I want to encourage people, we need to have conversations about this. Get a little shirt, get a sweatshirt, a hat, whatever the swag is there. It's in a bunch of things. I actually made these cool idea. My wife helped me think of this yesterday. There's these maternity ones. And I moved the words B'Tselem Elohim from the up top down to the belly. that even, that just says in the image of God. That's all it means. So she's wearing those words, in the image of God, over the little baby bump there to show that even in the womb, man, we are made in the image of God. And I just want people to come up and say, what does that mean? Because it doesn't say a Bible verse on it. It's just some Hebrew words. Nobody even would know it's even Hebrew. And I just want people to say, because if you put a Bible verse on it, somebody's going to say, oh, well, it's a Christian. Who cares? You can't put any of that stuff on it. You can't put the English on it. I want people to say, what does that mean? And all of a sudden, now, it says that I'm made in the image of God. So this is a great, I think, evangelistic tool to have conversations like we're having now, which is, I think, the future of where we need to be as Christians and solving the issues around us. So anyway, check that out, everybody. morethancake.org/shop for that. And then the show, of course, will be up there as well after this with any kind of other information or links that we'll have. And hopefully Leroy's article soon as he can get it edited. So take care, man. God bless everybody.